This is a series of talks that I delivered for the Teaching and Learning Unit at Cork Institute of Technology in 2016. For this particular session, the audio for the first two slides, or the start of the talk, wasn't recorded, so I recorded it subsequently, and hence you will notice a transition in the quality of the sound once you arrive at slide 3. Hi, I'd like to welcome you all this morning to this session on successful lecturing. I'd like to start by thanking you all for being here and for continuing to support the Teaching and Learning Unit. And I'd also like to thank all that are involved with the Create building for allowing us to use the seminar room in this lovely building for these sessions. So as I said, this morning we're going to look at the series is looking at some attributes of successful lecturers, and this morning we're going to look at how we might structure those. So in terms of thinking about successful lecturing, I'm kind of assuming two ideas, and we'd have mentioned those in the previous session as well. The first is that it's successful. If for it to be successful, we're assuming that students are going to learn during the actual lecture, as opposed to the learning that might happen subsequently by, working on problems and revising the notes and things like that. And the second assumption that I'm making is that it's successful if the learning that happens during a lecture is more than students would get if they kind of read a transcript of the lecture, or if they read a handout associated with it. So that we're doing things in the lecture which engages students, which helps them make sense of the material, and things like that. So those are sort of the core notions around successul lectures.
The sorts of learning outcomes that I would like that you would that I would hope that you would have at the end of the session would be to be able to discuss some of the elements that form a good introduction. One of the things that we know in terms of structuring it is if we introduce sort of activities, they have a big impact on motivation and learning. And often in the literature this is called active learning, so we're just going to briefly review kind of what that is and how we can do it, so to be able to explain the importance of it and the possible impact of it, to be able to implement some typical active learning techniques and the sort of structure that might go with it, and then to also discuss some of the things that we might have in a conclusion. So that's the sort of, I guess, where I'd like to go. And in terms of structure, one of the things I guess that we know about structure and why we're focusing on it here is that it has a lot to do with what we were talking about last week, which is motivation. And that if we can structure the lecture well, then we're more likely to motivate our students. And one of the ways in which we motivate them is by keeping or maintaining their attention. With that in mind, I'd like to see what you think. Imagine you have a typical class of 50 students, and imagine any 12-minute time span in that class. So it could be the first 12 minutes, the last 12 minutes, some period in the middle when you're explaining something to those students. So that's my horizontal axis there, the 0 to 12. On the vertical axis, we've got the percentage of students that are paying attention. What do you imagine that might look like? So first of all, do you understand what I'm asking you? Okay. So if you just take a minute and think about it, and maybe on the handout there, if you wouldn't mind to give obviously you don't know the answer to this, so there's no particularly right answer. I'm imagining many of you don't know the answer to this, so there's no particular right answer. So if you have a go at giving a sketch maybe of what you might think that would look like. actually, probably just for a minute, why don't you just have a look at your neighbours and see what they had. Actually, you're quite similar. Okay, so just a quick look around. There seems to be three sort of trends. Some are kind of starting up around here and kind of coming down and mellowing out. There's another shape which is starting again sort of up here, has a bit of a U and is coming back here towards the end. And then the third general one is an inverse of that, where it starts off low and kind of peaks and comes down again. I'm going to come back to this later on and look at some research that was done which looked at exactly this this problem or this issue of attention and what attention patterns look like. And I guess one of the things that we're trying to do in terms of the structure, or at least one of the things that I'm trying to do when I lecture and I'm thinking of the structure, is I'm thinking of attention patterns and what we can do to keep attention. Because if we don't have attention, there is no learning. So it's really important that we try and keep students' attention. And structure, as I said, is one of the ways in which we can make lectures clear and organized. From the literature, clear and organized, and I'm going to show you some examples of this in the next slide, is one of the themes that comes back all the time in terms of asking students what effective teaching means for them, or any of the reviews in sort of what good teaching practice is. Clear and organized is coming back. We talked last week about the notion of motivation, and one of the components of motivation was about adding value. That students perceived if we add value to the lectures, they were going to be more motivated, and this is one of the ways in which we can add value. Make it easier for them to learn by keeping them engaged and having a nice, clear, organized structure. So for those reasons, structure is important because it has a big impact on motivation, and motivation has an impact on learning. I mentioned that we'll have a look at what the literature, or briefly what the literature says. It is quite varied depending on the sorts of sources that you consult. So like some of the early literature, 1985, effective teaching was enthusiastic, clear, interactive, kind of orientated towards tasks, about establishing rapport with your learners, and it was organized. And then a later study, 10 years later, sort of different things coming out, but we can start to see, again, we've got this notion of organized and clear and group interaction happening. Much more recent one, Delaney in 2010, engaging and organized. And again, a quite recent one, Revel and Wainwright, participative. And the other terms vary, or some of the other terms vary, not all of them do. There seems to be this trend that comes out, or this theme that comes out, that clear is important, organized is important, and interactive is important in terms of what students value. So when I'm thinking of organizing a lecture, those are some of the things that are foremost in my mind. And when I ask my own students, they say very similar things. So at the end of each course, I would survey my students. One of the questions at the end of the survey would be, an open-ended question like, what did you like most about the course? And no, this is not the only thing that they say, but when I analyze that, there is a theme there all the time, which is around the structure of the course and the things that, that lectures were organized and that made it easy to understand. They really appreciated the organization and layout of the material. They had a clear idea and various things. So again, in terms of our own practice here in CIT, it seemed to resonate with what they're saying in some of the literature. So going on to sort of the topic, which is an introduction. What should an introduction do? An introduction should do what I have tried to do this morning so far, which is capture attention. I tried to do that through the little graph where we're looking at what does attention look like. Often in my undergraduate, I'm doing the same thing. I'm putting a question there at the very start, which is either related to the topic or linking this topic with what we would have talked about the week before, so that they see those relationships and I get them thinking about where we were last week and where we're trying to go this week, and make those things clear. We want to try and create relevance all the time. We mentioned this last week. Why are we talking about this? Why is this of interest? So again, we'll try to do that by looking at the structure, and why is structure, which is our today's topic, important, and that's to do with primarily to do with motivation, for example. Often we'd be linking the topic to previous sessions, an outline of where we're going to go, so the sorts of learning that we expect our students to be able to get. And again, we have to remember that most of our lectures are like 50 or 60 minutes long. We talk a lot. Students don't always clearly understand what was important and what was trivial, or where the focus was in that hour. So I think at the start, or someplace at the start, and again at the end, it's at the things that I really want you to take away. These are the important things that you should be able to do at the end of it, and it's about focus for them so that they know what is important. And as I said, we talk a lot, so it's not obvious. It's not always obvious what is important. So a statement of the intended goals or outcomes of the lecture at the start is important. So the literature would sort of suggest that an introduction should include these things. And in my practice, I would find no more than this morning, it usually takes about 10 minutes. It could take 20 minutes depending on how much I want to go back over previous material. Like, it does take time, but I think if we don't spend that time and we just, like, I had loads of lectures as an undergraduate where someone came in the door with their pen already in their hand and up at the board and just started writing, loads of them. Like, it wasn't uncommon. Like, there was no links, there was no, this is what we're doing, this is why it's important. It's just, this is the content, get it into you and get it down, and you start writing as fast as you can, trying to keep up before the board is cleared and all this. Like, okay, it's one way of doing it, but the literature would suggest that it's not the most beneficial way, because we don't have a lot of the things that we need, or that they would suggest that we need, in terms of the relevance and focusing on what's important and getting attention and all those types of things. So a good introduction should try and do some of those things. In terms of the body of the lecture, for like an hour-long lecture, I would be thinking of 3 to 4 main points that we want learners to take. And for me, and again the literature would be kind of resonating with this, is that we should be focusing on key concepts or things that students are likely to find difficult. Right? If there's lots of, not that if there's lots of, but students are well able to read fairly routine sort of information. So like, if there's lots of routine stuff, I would argue there's no reason why you can't just give that as a handout and say, look, you need to read this and understand this, or be aware of these procedures, or whatever it might be. But there's always lots of material that's difficult for students, and I think that's the value in a lecture. Can we explain that to students? Because it's much more interactive. We can ask them questions, we can see where they're at, we can revise it, we can go over it, we can include examples, and we can respond to those students there and then. And that's one of the values that we can add to a lecture. And you can't do that with a handout. And so if we focus on things that we know that students really struggle with, the concepts, the key concepts, the principles, the techniques, and that's the focus of our lectures, then I think in terms of writing it, a lecture, and in terms of thinking about a concept, I always try to go back to when I first encountered it, which is increasingly more difficult because I'm getting older, and it's now 20 years since I first met most of those concepts. And the more I teach them, the further you are removed from them, the more familiar you become with the topic, and the more difficult it is to imagine the issues students have with those topics. But I think, again, if we're to be, I think one of the ways we can deliver effective lectures is to think about how it was to encounter that idea first, the difficulties that we had, the ways that it didn't make sense, and to try and address those things. And then the active learning is the bit that's there, which is about short activities to engage learners with ideas, provide opportunities to discuss or apply them, or introduce examples to extend them. I would say that activities shouldn't be just about entertaining students. It shouldn't be just about a distraction, just to get them back into the room, although that's of value in itself. It should really be adding to what you've talked to. So if we've talked about a concept, and like one of the things I would often do is I talk about a concept and then I'm trying to see, like, have they got this idea? How am I going to assess whether they've got it or not? Well, let's ask them to apply it to some relatively simple context and see, can they apply the idea? If they can apply the idea, then they understand it. If they can't, it needs more work. So active learning is about that sort of idea. The usual format, or a common format for active learning, is you've like 10 or 15 minutes sort of lecture, followed by some activity to reinforce it. In terms of kind of convincing you, I suppose that there's some value in this. And I think I have all the references. I should have all the references for these at the end of the handout. I do have all the references for these at the end of the handout. There's a study in 2014 which focused on looking at active learning in relation to the science, technology, engineering and mathematics, the STEM disciplines. So they would have reviewed what had been published before, so they looked at 158 studies where there would have been experimental data. So there would have been a control group and there would have been an active learning group. Okay, and they would have been comparing learning outcomes from both of those groups. Right? So they would have identified 158 studies in the STEM discipline which did this type of thing, and then they collated the results. Okay, so they averaged the results. They had two main results. One was the impact of active learning on the average grade of students. And I have four options there. If we look at the first one there, active learning resulted in an average grade increase of 20%, 0%, 6%, or 13%. Again, I understand that you don't know the answer to this. I'm curious about what you think it might be. If you think about it for a minute, and actually what I should have done, of course, is redone those as 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll change those to A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and D is 4. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to hold up a finger representing which one of those you think it might be. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Is that okay? Are we ready? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, or 4. What do you think? We've got, most of you think it's 4, I would guess. It's 3, 6% is the result that they had. Which I guess isn't massive, right? But there are a few other studies where when you look at a large collection of the literature, that there's very clear evidence for any other pedagogy. The only other one that I'm aware of is feedback, where there's a very demonstrable impact on grades is through feedback. And feedback and active learning are the only two that I'm aware of. Even when you look at other things like much more radical things like problem-based learning and stuff, by and large, there's no evidence to suggest that has an impact on grades. What about the second one, our failure rates? Again, we might do the same thing. So A, B, C, or D. When you're ready. So again, we might do the same thing if we 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on what you think. If you're ready.
It's a small finger 4, sorry, Tom.
4. Are you ready? Okay, let's see. Okay, a mixture of 2s and 4s, I guess. 35%. So failure rates, I think, in their course, so their average failure rate without active learning was something like 35%, and it went down to something like just over 20% using active learning. So while active learning doesn't maybe have impact, 6% is still significant. You're going to go from, let's say if you're at 45, you're up to the next bracket, 50 something. So it's not insignificant. But where it seems to have a real impact is those students that normally struggle academically, those students that are failing. There's a huge potential for those students to improve instead of failing, to pass through active learning, and that's one of, and I guess that's the most recent and most kind of significant study that has looked at that. I know it is focused on the STEM discipline, but there's no reason why the same result is not likely to be found in humanities, for example. The question that I posed you at the start, active learning and attention. So this is kind of a complicated result. We're looking at, it was a study done of 3 courses in chemical engineering, which are labelled at the top Chem 2, Chem 1 and Chem 3. They did have, and the study used clickers. Are you familiar with clickers, where you press one of the buttons? So they asked students to record their attention declines using clickers. So when they came back into the room after wandering away for a minute or whatever, they were asked to press the button when they re-engaged with the lecture. And they had 3 options. One was if they thought they had been inattentive for a minute, for 2 to 3 minutes, or for more than 5 minutes. Right? For the first 2 weeks of the lectures, they used these as a trial, just as a practice run, and then for the next 4 weeks, they gathered data on the attention decline. Most of the lectures did use some variety of active learning techniques, often demonstrations in them, so that the lecturer talked for a while and then they did something like, as I said, mostly a demonstration. So in terms of analysing it, they split it up, or they identified the portion where they were talking most frequently, which was 12 minutes. So 12 minutes was the average time that the lecturer was talking, and that's why the horizontal axis there is that 12 minutes. So they split up their hour into 12-minute segments. They looked at those times when the lecturer was talking, and they looked then at the clicker responses for those times. And those are the sorts of curves. Chem 2 and Chem, so let's see, Chem 2 and Chem 1 didn't use a lot of active learning. They did techniques. And remember now, this is the percentage of students who are clicking that are saying they are not paying attention, the inverse of what I asked you to do. 70%, at times. There's 2 interesting things, I think. One of the things is we can see that attention decline varies a lot. Okay, so like the notion that they're going to be paying attention for like 5 minutes or anything at a time doesn't seem to, based on this, doesn't seem to hold up. That that it's much more variable than that, and it's quite high. So if we take, let's say, either the black or the sort of purple curve there, I'm guessing the average there is something around 40%. If we try and draw a line through one of those. Chem 3, there was 2, I guess, it was a much smaller class than these. These were typically about 50 students. Chem 3 had 20-odd students, I think, in it. But they also used a lot more active learning techniques. Okay? And that's why, the average time that the lecturer was talking here is shorter than those 2, because I guess that was the format of it too. So the evidence would suggest, again, that active learning, or maybe one of the reasons why students perform better, the results in the previous slide where students perform better, is because if we use active learning a lot, we're going to keep attention, and attention is about, or when we have students' attention, they're more likely to learn. It is one study, and again, there haven't been a huge amount of studies looking particularly at attention. So, there are, like everything else, until you get more data, there are questions, but it certainly is interesting. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to finish up very quickly. So in terms of lecture structure, there are in my view, three core components. I think the introduction is really important, probably more important in my view than a conclusion, and likewise the body. So in terms of the introduction, the sorts of things we're trying to do is grab students' attention, stress the relevance or make the relevance of the material. In my case, trying to make links with prior ideas, or it doesn't even have to be prior, but the broader maybe learning outcomes of my module or the broader ideas associated with the course, and focusing in on specific learning outcomes for that session so that students are aware of what they're expected to learn out of this particular class. In terms of the body, my argument would be about less content, 3 or 4 main ideas, and focusing on explanations and applications and the use of simple activities like we did today, which are typically just short, 3 to 5 minutes. The argument for keeping them short is if they're any longer and students don't know how to do it, don't know how to start it, then it's a waste of their time. So like if you design something that's going to take 10 minutes for someone to do and they don't know how to start it, that's 10 minutes they're sitting in a lecture doing nothing, and that's not, conducive. So we're looking at activities that are short. If you want to do something longer, then we need to break it up into parts. So like if we have a longer problem, we might think of, well, what is the main principle that we need to solve it, and that's the first element of it. Then what's the formula, and what are the components of the formula, what are the numbers? So we split it up into the sequence that we need, to address it, and we take it step by step. But typically it's really short, as I said, 3 to 5 minutes, usually around the 3 minutes, sort of activities. And then in terms of the conclusion, it's obviously about summarizing, often about integrating it maybe with, as I said, the learning outcomes associated with the module, reinforcing those learning outcomes, that this is the main thing that I want you to get from it, and providing time for questions if they haven't been, particularly if you haven't been encouraging them throughout the session, that to give our students the opportunity to ask questions and the time to ask questions towards the end of it. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and if you have any concerns or issues or questions or thoughts on it, please feel free either now or at any time to send me an email. And